as an investigation into the question of the authentic perspective on Paul, namely that the first century figure Paul authored 7 actual letters, so the 7 authentic letters. I explored the authentic perspective from many angles of the question of authenticity, criteria used in the authentication process, the historicity of Paul, and scholarship on ancient epistles. None of this research yielded certainty or even the likelihood of the authentic perspective. In fact, I found the reverse to be true, namely that research in all of these areas indicated that the authentic perspective does not withstand critical scrutiny. So I think this is how we get a character, Paul, and he's an important person because of the book of Acts, that the letters follow on Acts. Acts is the one that formulates the character, and as you rightly said, from Saul, it's a characterization of a Saul character, which is literary.
If I can just ask you directly, I think there's a guy that this is all based off of, or I just think the whole thing was constructed, what would you say?
I think that the character, Paul, begins in the book of Acts.
Dr. Nina Livesey is a professor of religious studies, emerita, at the University of Oklahoma. She's the author of Circumcision as a Malleable Symbol, 2010, Galatians and the Rhetoric of Crisis, 2016, as well as the book that we're talking about today, The Letters of Paul, in their Roman literary context. In this discussion, we are going to discuss the 7 authentic letters that Paul wrote to the earliest churches in Christianity. Are these 7 authentic epistles really authentic, or did someone else who is not Paul write these 7 letters that we think is Paul? And last but not least, the question, did Paul even exist? Is Paul based on a literary trope like King Saul in the Old Testament, chasing David the Messiah, just like Saul in the New Testament, pursuing Christ? All that and more, you are about to attain true gnosis. Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And joining me today is Dr. Nina Livesey. And Dr. Nina Livesey's work, as you just saw in the introduction with the book that's in the description, please go and check that out. It's starting to ruffle some feathers, but also on the internet, at least in my circles, people are excited about this. So there's excitement on some parts of the internet, and there is ruffled feathers in other parts, and which is good. This is the same reaction that I get from other scholars that I talk to who come out with stuff like, Jonathan Adler's book, when he said that Judaism is a product of the 2nd century BC and no before that. These are the type of scholars that I want to talk to, who are coming out and sort of challenging paradigms that are just they're axioms. We just accept them as true. We don't even question them. And the one that we're talking about today is Paul's epistles. It's an axiom of biblical scholarships. The 7 authentic epistles, these are definitely written by Paul. These are definitely from the 40s to the 50s AD. And no one's really thought about this. And I just want to go on a quick little detour. Another thing I recently popped into, and I'm going to get to your question in a minute. I also recently read an article from a scholar. His name slips my mind, but I'm sure I'll put it on the screen right now as I'm saying this, who wrote an article, and it's got it, the Oxford website has it on there, and it's on JSTOR as well, about how Pliny the Younger's epistle to Trajan might be a forgery.
And he's looking at all the other Pliny epistles, and he's saying these ones all have a certain grammar to it, but the one that's written to Trajan that happens to mention Christians, he says this one does not look like the other ones. Now, put that aside for a second. There's other scholars who have come out and said, hey, Josephus, that the passage that mentions Christians and Jesus, that is definitely probably at a high level interpolation, if not the whole thing's forged. And then it's like, okay, those are the first two people to mention Jesus outside of Paul's epistles or Clement. And if we were to accept what those scholars are saying as true, all of a sudden the next source that ever mentions Christianity or Jesus or anybody is in the first quarter of the 2nd century, which means Christianity might actually be a product of the 2nd century for all we know. And maybe it has some proto-Christian roots in the 1st century. Anyways, I said a lot there, but I'm basically leading up to what you're doing with your book, which is all about these 7 authentic letters of Paul. And so for those who aren't familiar with your work on Paul, can you kind of clarify what you've uncovered in your research regarding the authenticity of Paul's letters and why you come to that conclusion?
Okay, thank you for your question. The book project began as an investigation into the question, and you rightly introduced the whole situation of the book, into the question of the authentic perspective on Paul, namely that the 1st century figure Paul authored 7 actual letters. Sometimes I call it sent correspondence or genuine correspondence. So those letters, for your audience, are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those are the 7 authentic letters. So I explored the authentic perspective from many angles, including the modern history of the question of authenticity, criteria used in the authentication process, the historicity of Paul, and scholarship on ancient epistles. None of this research yielded certainty or even the likelihood of the authentic perspective. In fact, I found the reverse to be true, namely that research in all of these areas indicated that the authentic perspective does not withstand critical scrutiny. To explain it more simply for you and your audience, I found that from every perspective that I just mentioned, every avenue of investigation, the authentic perspective appears to be forced. So its conceptual bases, how it derives the idea of the authentic perspective, is forced. So some examples. Modern predetermined notions of Christian origins bring the authentic perspective to the fore. Pauline letters become assessed as authentic as those predetermined notions are read back into them, into the letters. So as I detail in the book, the prominent 19th century scholar F.C. Bauer deemed 4 Pauline letters authentic and thereby historically reliable. According to him, the 4 well reflected the emergence of Christianity in the 1st century. So what does he do? He relies on 1 Corinthians 1, 11 to 12, where he notes a fundamental divisions in early Christ communities, which resulted in 2 main factions, a pro-Pauline, non-Jewish party, and a pro-Petrine, Jewish Christian party. From these 2 factions, Bauer recognized 2 different religious perspectives: a universalistic, law-free, religion represented by Paul and his non-Jewish group, and a particularistic, law-bound version of Christianity represented by Peter and his group. According to Bauer, the discussion in this passage accurately depicts Christian emergence in the mid-first century. However, according to Bauer, it was not only 1 Corinthians, and this is how he gets the 4 letters, that provided evidence of Christian emergence out from a particularistic, law-bound religion of Judaism, but also elements of Galatians, Romans, and 2 Corinthians. And that's how he has these 4 letters, which he calls the Hauptbriefe, or the chief epistles. Bauer's reasoning, however, for the historical reliability of these 4 letters is circular. Here I am simplifying. Bauer reads his contemporary theology that's in itself invested in the notion that Christianity advanced into a universalistic salvific faith out from under a defective and particularist Judaism. He reads all of that back into the letters, so that in deeming the Hauptbriefe historically reliable, Bauer is historicizing his theology. So that's one example of forcing. But otherwise, there's another main example of what I would call forcing, and that comes from an influential early 20th century scholar, Adolf Deismann, who reads his romantic notions of Christian origins back into Pauline letters. So according to Deismann, it's not 4 letters that are authentic and historically reliable, but all 13 New Testament canonical letters, exclusive of Hebrews, he considers genuine or real letters that the Apostle Paul has authored. And they're also, by virtue of that, they're historically reliable. He needs them to be historically reliable, in fact. In Deismann's view, Christianity originated in an ahistorical, pristine, you might think of it as a Garden of Eden-like setting, and he refers to this period as primitive Christianity, Urchristentum. He describes it as a time when the Spirit was alive and active, leading the earliest Christian community, which was comprised of simple folk. Their writings were barely literate, and they were spirit directed. The Pauline letters were genuine because they came from that untainted, spirit-led period. And Deismann assessed that the genuineness of the letters was even evident in their style, which indicated for him simplicity, honesty, and spontaneity. So, like Bauer, Deismann's assessment of the status of the letters as genuine, or we would say authentic here, right, also relied on circular logic, and he reads the letters through the lens of his predetermined, but now this time, a historical romantic notion of Christian emergence. And here's the rub. So even as scholarship swiftly criticized Deismann's methodology for how he assesses the style and the form of the Pauline letters, his determination of their status as genuine took hold. So now we have a notion of authentic, but it's not based on anything that withstands critical scrutiny. I'm also saying it's forced with regard to its criteria of authenticity. Once the Hauptbriefe were accepted as authentically Pauline, those are Bauer's 4 chief letters, albeit uncritically and for theological and ideological reasons. Scholars simply added on to the list of those 4 letters. We eventually get 3 more. If they could corroborate in some way the perspective of the Hofbrauche, the perspective that Bauer had of the Hofbrauche. So that was one criteria, which doesn't seem reasonable. Scholars likewise deemed letters beyond the chief epistles authentic if they contained favorite Pauline expressions, if they displayed consistency with the book of Acts, or if they were cited by early Christian authors. These criteria are hardly rigorous. A letter cannot be deemed authentic simply because the scholar happens to like what Paul has to say within it. And Bauer himself deemed the book of Acts unreliable as history. So today, such a criterion would be roundly rejected on historical grounds. So another instance of forcing. But the third, I'm saying that the authentic perspective is forced with regard to the question of the historicity of Paul, the ascribed author, right? Seemingly autobiographical and biographical passages within the letters and Acts concerning Paul, such as 2 Corinthians 11:32-33, in which we see the apostle in Damascus being threatened by the governor of King Aretas, or in Acts 18:12-17, in which Paul in Corinth defends himself against accusations brought by Jews before Gallio. They've been used to historicize Paul and locate him, firmly locate him, you might say, in the specified ancient city during the time in which those other figures, known figures, in this case, King Aretas, who is a known figure, and Gallio, also a known figure, were active. However, reliance on passages such as these is methodologically flawed, as no other sources can confirm the same activities of Paul with those known figures. It's likewise not too terribly difficult to ascertain that these incidents add dramatic appeal to advance rhetorical goals. So, for instance, in the passage, in the first passage, Paul escapes by being let down in a basket through a window. But that method of escape occurs elsewhere in Scripture, where it serves as a literary trope, and I cite some examples in the book of where that occurs. In the second passage, Paul's defense against hostile Jews, one encounters a dominant theme in Acts, which contributes to one of the narrative's main goals, namely the advance of the Jesus movement or the Christ movement to Gentiles, as the Jews are in the process of rejecting it. So Paul's so-called appearance before Gallio is a prime example of that motif that you find in Acts, a dominant motif. But it's also forced with regard to an understanding of ancient epistles. So when assessing Pauline letters as genuine correspondence, which is what Deisman does, some modern epistolary theorists came to regard the ancient letter as the near equivalent to oral speech. With this evaluation of the letter, it was as if Paul could be as though present through his letter. So there's a tendency to try to historicize Paul through the medium of the letter. For another epistolary theory is some scholars interpreted the letter form, which there is a standard form, an opening, a letter body, and a closing, as having the ability to deliver letter-like information, a greeting, for instance, independent of authorial agency. I go through a lot more details in the book about this. I'm summarizing here. But with both of these theories, it's as though the letter could speak for itself. Yet neither of these modern epistolary theories, which again I'm saying is forced, are found within the ancient record. The modern theories not only render to the letter an enhanced power, but also make Pauline letters unique among ancient letters. So that's not so coherent methodologically as well. Finally, there's one more instance of forcing, if you will, and that is with regard to the classification as a genuine Greco-Roman letter. So post-Deisman, scholars went to great lengths to compare Pauline letters to common Greco-Roman letters, with a goal of providing evidence of the genuineness of Pauline letters. However, these studies yielded negative results. By comparison with common Greco-Roman letters, thought to be genuine letters or real letters, canonical Pauline letters are longer, their structure is more complex, their opening and closing formulae differ, and they're distinctly theological, and their content, and this is disputed in the scholarship, but it's not, if you look at it closely, not everyday issues, but largely theological in nature. However, when pressed to assess their findings, the scholars who are doing this comparison, they end up rationalizing that due to his pressing mission, Paul had to make modifications to the letter form. So in other words, they're still genuine letters, but Paul had to change them up because of Paul's special mission. So quite a bit of forcing from various
How do we know
angles.
Paul had to change it up, you know?
You're right.
There was so much that you just presented there that I'm fascinated by. Just before I go on to my next question about some of the criticism, I just wanted to just ask you, if you can, just a quick little side. The older opinion is that Paul was writing these letters to sort of like these Greco-Jewish communities all across like, you know, Philippi and Corinth and Ephesus, and he's writing these letters, and there seems to be, and I've always wondered, this is always, I had my own personal documentary that I made that's like 3 hours long about early Christianity, and one of the questions I explored in that video was, who is Paul writing to if the Gospels aren't even out yet? And that has always been one of the things, like, are they Jewish communities? Are they Hypsisterians, worshipers of the God Most High that are just Greeks? Are they something of both? And but like you're possibly saying these could be later, which would make more sense, because now all of a sudden we have people who are familiar with the story of Christ. Now all of a sudden Christ crucified means something, rather than like, how can Paul say in Christ crucified, and this church of some people living all the way in Macedonia who never read the gospel, what does that mean to them? You know,
Yeah,
I've always been fascinated by that.
I really, I see your line of thinking and agree with you. It There's a lot that does not make sense about the authentic perspective, and so I do rearrange the pieces, and it seems a lot more reasonable, if I can say so myself, when the pieces are rearranged. and the letters come later, and that is one of the issues is of this death and resurrection, is one of the things that occurred to me. I don't mention that very much in the book, but that is one of the issues that's in the background of my thoughts.
Yeah, and just as you pointed out, and I'm just going to comment on what you said, is the letters, they don't read like a normal letter. Like, hey, how's the kids doing? What are you guys up to? They're like this. It's packed with philosophy and theology. It's
Hmm.
got that middle Platonic Stoic leaning, but also
Right.
very Jewish and theological, and you know,
Hmm.
and yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And like you even pointed out, the people were saying, "Oh, well, it might have been originally a real letter, but then Paul had to change it." But then when I hear that, I go, "Wait, if why do we think Paul changed it? What if it's someone else? What if let's say there really was a real letter of Paul to the Corinthians, but somebody decades later gets a hold of it in Corinth, and then they add their own,
Mm.
they rewrite the whole thing, and now all of a sudden it's a whole new document now." That's another question I think we need to explore. So,
Right.
so does your work suggest anything about the historicity of Paul as a person, of him existing, or is it just the letters in the Bibles? And you and I briefly discussed, just to throw a bone to the mythicists out there, the idea that there's a Saul in the Old Testament who's chasing around David, and there's a Saul of the New Testament who's sort of chasing around the Christ, or the followers of Christ, and they both repent after they're snuck up on, if you will. Like Saul
Mhm.
gets snuck up on by David, and he repents and says, "I'm sorry." And then once again, walking through the wilderness, there's Saul number two, and he gets snuck up on by Jesus, and he repents. And so you kind of can I can kind of see the mythicist logic in doubting Paul. But your work and your book, what do you say about this question?
My book actually does get into the question of the historicity of Paul, to answer you directly. And I hinted that also in the answer to the previous question. So, as if you've glanced through the book, which you likely have, I do make lengthy, reasoned arguments, and I want to stress that, for my position on the question of the historicity of Paul and on the status of the Pauline letters. So it started out, of course, as the question to the status of the letters, but I also needed to talk about the author, to complete that whole picture of the authenticity. Um, but then I'll also say, and this answers a little of what you were saying at the beginning here, it's not terribly helpful, to be taken out of the context of the book and reduced to a single issue, right, of just whether Paul is historical or not. It The book leads to that. Um, Here's something else as a side note. It's this insistence actually on the historicity of Paul that accounts in large measure, I would argue, for those areas of forcing that I just talked about on the authentic perspective. I mean, why force it, if the letters could be something else, right? But I did notice all these instances of forcing. In my book, to get a little bit more to you answering your question, I argue that it makes best interpretive sense to regard Paul and then also the Apostle Paul, there's like two characters going on here, as biblical characters. In part, this is because there is commonality among New Testament books between the book of Acts, long considered a work of fiction, and the collection of Pauline letters. You were alluding to some of this earlier. The points of commonality draw Pauline letters into the orbit of Acts, not to provide historical evidence, but instead to suggest intertextuality. Otherwise put, I understand Pauline letters as occupying the same type of literary space, scripture, as Acts and the Apostles. I hope that answers your question.
It does, because but that also still opens up the thing. There could be a historical kernel of a guy, maybe his name was Saul or Paulus, in a Latin, more Latin name, I think. Latin, right? Paulus.
Mm-hmm.
And Saul would be a Jewish name.
Right.
There could have been maybe there really was a guy, but you're saying what we're getting here is not a real person, it's more of a construction.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were if I can just ask you directly, whether you would lean towards, yeah, I think there's a guy that this is all based off of, or I just think the whole thing was constructed, what would you say?
I think that the character Paul begins in the book of Acts. And then that becomes an important character, as you know, in the second half of Acts is completely,
You think it's about Peter, and Peter's the
it's
main
not.
character for the first 8 chapters.
Yeah,
Then all of a sudden, Paul's he's the protagonist. It just changes up on you in the middle, if anyone who's read it.
right. So I think this is how we get a character, Paul, and he's an important person because of the book of Acts. And according to modern epistolary theory, letters attributed to a person follow on the characterization of that person or what is known otherwise about that person. So that's how I have been able to say that the letters follow on Acts. Acts is the one that formulates the character. And as you rightly said, from Saul, it's a characterization of a Saul character, which is literary.
So let me get this straight for people who are watching this right now. Let me just try to sum it up in my own, so that maybe they can understand this better. If 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 it's the first time Saul is introduced is in the book of Acts, and he happens to be have an antecedent, which is common in New Testament books all over the Gospels. There's Isaac carrying his wood, Jesus carrying his wood. There's all this mimesis between the old and the new. Um, so there's prime examples of it. Isaac carrying his wood is one of them. You know, Jesus having 12 disciples, and then there's 12 tribes of Jacob, that type of thing. You even have Psalms that talk about the betrayer, and some of them, sometimes Judah is the betrayer in some of these sources. And then you get a Judas in the New Testament who fits that role. So you could see that there's all this mimesis. In Acts, it's almost no different. Luke Acts is basically doing, okay, now we're going to rewrite Saul from Samuel, from the books of Samuel, and we're going to rewrite him as another Saul who is, instead of chasing around David, who's the Messiah, a small m Messiah, he's anointed by Samuel, a very important Old Testament anointed king. And then in the New Testament, you have this new anointed king of the Jews, and there's another guy named Saul who's attacking them and chasing them and doesn't like them, and he wants to go back to the old order, not this new order. So if that's the case, then it's possible that Saul is just a construction, a literary construction, doesn't even exist. Wow.
So yeah, Saul
I think it has
changes.
to be on the table. This has to be on the table. I know
Sure.
people are going to fight this and go, "You're crazy. This is nonsense. This is the cheese," but it's not. And it might not be. There might have been a guy, and they might have written this story based on his name or something. Oh, his name's Saul. It reminds you of Old Testament Saul. Let's create a story based. That could be that could be a possibility. But I think what you're saying has to at least be on the table going forward, and it needs to be. People need to at least consider it. So,
right.
and let's get into the idea of fake epistles, because in the ancient world, if I'm not mistaken, or let me just ask you, was it common practice or even just known that people wrote fake epistles? Or I know, for example, you have fake dialogues. Plato writes these fake dialogues between Socrates and his students, and they're philosophical. They're teaching you something. They're not real. But in the world of epistles, because there's tons of ancient epistles that are floating around. Some of them are authentic, some of them aren't. You get ones from Pythagoras, you get some from Aristotle to his Aristotle writing to Alexander, and people doubt if those are real. What is your thoughts on epistles in the ancient world? Are there any known examples of fictional epistles?
That's a very good question. So the short answer is yes. And this question also bears centrally on my thesis. There are indeed plenty and abundance of fictional letters in the ancient world. The first known mention of a letter in Western culture occurs in Homer. Later, we find embedded letters in the writings of ancient Greek historians and authors, in writers such as Thucydides, Herodotus, Euripides, but closer to home, if you will, in the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew tradition. We were just talking about the Hebrew tradition with Saul, right? There's a recent very good study, by the way, by L. Michael White, so a shout out to them, and G. Anthony Ketty, on the fictive epistle of Arestius, which is a long letter, which is used to tell how the Septuagint came to be written. And
Yes.
it's all in a letter. It's a fictive
70,
letter.
70 magical priests that all retold.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a fake epistle.
it's a fake epistle. It's a great example of a fake epistle. But so, yes, they exist. So it's
I think in
strange.
Maccabees, in the book of Maccabees, you got those epistles between the leader of the Spartans and the leader of the Jews going back and forth. We're all sons of Abraham. Really? I don't think the Spartans were saying that.
And it's all over the Hebrew Bible, many embedded letters. So it's strange, I would say, that given the abundance of ancient fictive letters, Pauline scholars rarely, if ever, consider that the core Pauline letters could be fictive. So an aside there. In my book, I highlight a special type of ancient fictive letter, and those are pseudonymous letter collections. Why is that? Well, we have Pauline letters as a collection, so that you should have that in the back of your mind. Collection is important with regard to Pauline letters. So, according to a modern scholar of ancient epistles, Owen Hodkinson, actually, these types of letters, namely pseudonymous letter collections, were incredibly popular. And they were, according to him, the most frequent type of Greek letter from all periods. So these are letter collections attributed to known figures, whether fictive or factual. And in my book, I review the collections of Plato, Apollonius of Tyana, and the correspondence between Paul and Seneca. They all rely on prior knowledge of the famous person, and they take that figure into new directions. In the letters, the figure often becomes more speculative or reflective. So, for example, in his biography, Apollonius of Tyana is an active figure who has associations with supernatural beings. He's depicted as a healer and a preacher of asceticism. Yet a far different Apollonius emerges from the letters attributed to him, where he's more like a philosopher who renders advice to important public figures. So in the popular letter collection, the correspondence between Paul and Seneca, that relies on Paul as a letter writer and Seneca as a philosopher. And this collection brings the two figures together in a friendly exchange as though they know each other, although they never did. So Seneca is made to comment on the style of Paul's writing style. So, as alluded to, the common characteristic of these pseudonymous fictive letter collections is that the later letters depict the known figure, Plato or whomever, in ways that depart from
Right.
how he's otherwise known.
Yep.
They take liberties with the characterization and thoughts of that known figure, and there are other figures.
Socrates is a prime example of how Plato can
Mm,
take Socrates, and all of a sudden Socrates is a Platonist, and he's debating forms, and he's going, "I think, there's a idea in a higher ideals," and wait, that's not Socrates, so, okay,
yeah. So generally speaking, these fictive pseudonymous letters, they exploit various known features of the letter genre to bring about realistic-like letters from known figures. And I argue that the Pauline collection accords nicely with those defining characteristics of that type of letter, that pseudonymous collection, fictive collection. That's a letter type, an actual letter type. So we don't have to say Pauline letters are unique. They actually fit with a type of known ancient letter.
What methodology or how can we tell if epistles are authentic or not?
Yeah, this is a hard question, and thank you for it. Um, the book certainly aims to answer this question, which I address not through one, but many avenues. There's likely no one definitive methodology for determining authenticity. As mentioned earlier, comparative analyses have been employed where Pauline letters are evaluated according to various letter-like features against other letters that are thought to be genuine. And the comparisons, as I mentioned, were made according to, excuse me, length, letter formula, structure, and content. That methodology seems reasonable to me. I also addressed the question of the historicity of the inscribed letter parties. We talked a little bit about that. The letter sender and the letter recipients. In addition, I investigated topics addressed within the Pauline letters, such as the apostles' statements regarding the Jewish law, and in particular circumcision, which I've worked quite a bit on circumcision in my earlier book. First book was largely on the topic of circumcision, and considered whether those topics were consistent with a first century setting, or other first century works, you might even say. And finally, this is all to try to get it to answer your question about methodology. I looked for external evidence of the letters that would indicate or necessitate even a first century compositional date. So, if we had letters of Paul and individual letters of Paul, right, in the middle of the first century, then you could make a stronger argument for authenticity, but we don't.
Um, do you think it's possible that there could be some authentic layer within Paul's epistles, some real kernel of so a guy named Paul really wrote it that have been and then later added to or redacted over, and thus the letters did exist at some point, but what we have today is so edited and so separated from the earlier that it's a new text now.
I do find that Pauline letters were redacted and expanded, as you've just explained. And even I find that more letters were added to the collection, such as the pastorals. We think those are later, and I agree with that. First and Second Timothy and Titus. But I don't think, to answer your question, that there was an original set of genuine letters authored by the Apostle Paul. I argue, and this is restating what I most likely said earlier here, that the letters rely on the book of Acts for the character Paul, an aspect consistent with pseudonymous letter collections. So the figure Paul was made known then prior to the letters attributed to him. So in modern scholarship, the book of Acts follows by narrative logic on a gospel account and is more recently dated to the 2nd century, maybe the first, third, or later in the 2nd century. So that makes the letters, which by your question, you're implying the early nuggets of them, but I would change it around because of the reliance on Acts and say that the letters in whatever form, early form, later form, redacted form, unredacted form, that they're late comers as far as Christian writings go. They're later. So they wouldn't fit then with the context in which they're looking like they should fit. They look like they should be engaging with the 1st century, but they actually emerge in the 2nd century.
Fascinating. This has been mind-blowing so far. Do you see anything in the letters of Paul that stand out to you as propagandistic, or is there any sense of an agenda going on? And maybe the epistles are aimed at, especially the pastoral ones like Timothy. Maybe they're going against the Gnostic groups that are around, or some other particular movement in early Christianity. What do you see?
So I don't take up that question of the Gnostics in the book, but I do attribute the first sightings of Pauline letters to the school of Marcion, who was a 2nd century teacher who worked in Rome. According to the church fathers, Marcion was for them a heretic.
But he also had all of Paul's epistles plus Luke Acts. So he was, and according to church tradition in Greek Orthodoxy, his father was his Philologus, his name, was one of the 70 disciples mentioned in the book of Luke Acts. So like he was like not some random Joe Blow. He was like connected in that sense.
Right, an important figure. A lot of people knew of him, wrote about him, largely wrote against him. He ruffled feathers, right? I do say the letters posit a different Paul, an apostle Paul, distinct from the one found within Acts. So there's some kind of an agenda, you might say, with that, because it looks strategic that the letters could be a response to Acts. There is a different Paul going on there. So that could be a type of an agenda to address your question there. It's also said by Tertullian that Marcion's apostle Paul advanced only one gospel, namely the gospel that Marcion published, the Evangelion, and no other gospel, even though Marcion likely knew about other gospels. So I think even when I was writing the book, there's competition among the early writers. And you can see some of that competition, I think. Competition of points of view.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Last thing I wanted to ask you, why do you think Paul's letters are so central to Christianity?
Yeah, that's a $64,000 question, perhaps. Paul looms large, doesn't he? And the letters. Here, I don't know that I have the strongest answer to offer you, but other than to say, and we know this, you know it, I know it, Christian theology largely relies on the letters of Paul. When I talk about the letters in the book, I refer to them as teachings. So it would make sense that the theology would come from teachings, right? the Gospels are more narrative-like, and certainly the book of Acts is more narrative. So the teachings seem to come from the letters. So that could be one way of answering or accounting for the popularity of Paul and a popularity of the letters. But there's something else that occurs to me, and only from having worked on letters, I've thought a lot about letters, how they function, rhetorically, how they function. So I've wondered if the letter form hasn't played a larger role than formerly thought in the importance of the Pauline letters. I mentioned elsewhere, letters come across as real, and the readers really identify with a letter, connect with a letter, and even the letter sender figure, perhaps more so than they would in a narrative that has a hero figure. So I'm wondering then if that sense of personal identification, the I, the I figure, first person figure, that the letter genre necessitates really, has not played a role then in how those apostolic letters are so significant. So the letter genre may have something to do with it.
It also makes you think of the opening of Revelation, where it almost comes off as like little fake little letters to these 7 churches of Asia. Like, "Yay, the Church of Philadelphia, what are you doing over there? You're messing up." Like, that seems to be, maybe that was like the way to do it in this 2nd century period.
Right. And I'm intrigued by those letters of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3. And I've wondered if those were not the model. How did, one question you could ask, why did they put all of Paul's teachings in letters? Why use the letter? That's kind of interesting. Why pick up on a letter? But there you have in Revelation these sample letters, and they go to communities, don't they? Of course, in the traditional paradigm, Revelation follows on the letters of Paul, which of course were thought to be the earliest Christian writings. But if you flip the script and flip the paradigm, which is what I'm doing, Revelation comes early, can come earlier. It's maybe early first century, or late first century,
Right.
early second century, maybe 90s, 95
Yeah.
CE, right? So if the letters don't come until the second century, Revelation would precede it. And there you've got a pattern of letters, a
Yeah.
small model letters, short and sweet, and they follow a pattern, a very concise pattern. It's very redundant, those 7 letters, and they're all community letters.
And they're all to these communities in Asia Minor / Greece.
There's and
Yeah.
they're famous cities, all famous cities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Pergamum,
And
right.
and they're fictive. They're clearly fictive. It's in the scholarship that they're fictive letters. So perhaps the idea of a letter was influenced by Revelation letters. Something to think about.
It is very interesting. Well, this has been a phenomenal discussion. The book, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. Link is in the description right now. Check out the link and get the book for yourself and read it. And anything else you want to say about what you have going on right now?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And now it's a question of what what moves I make next. It's this letter continues to intrigue me, as I just mentioned, the rhetorical use of the letter, and I think that does continue actually beyond the apostolic letters. We've got a lot of letters out there in the Christian tradition.
Yeah, like Jesus writing to the king of what is it? What is that king's name? Somewhere over in Edessa.
Right.
Yeah.
That shows up in Eusebius.
Yeah. So this was
Right.
something that was there were Christians were really into, was these writing these letters.
Mhm. Right.
Um, and I think all you're doing is pointing out, look, why can't Paul be one of these? Why are we
Mhm.
very circular in logic to just have an axiom that these 7 letters were written by one person, therefore it's Paul?
Mhm.
Well, it's like that's circular logic. You're assuming it's Paul because the other one because they're all the same.
Mhm.
I don't know. Like it just I think I see what you're saying, and I think people should be this should be on the table going forward when we talk about Paul and when we talk about early Christianity.
Great. Thanks. I certainly agree with that.
Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Livesey, and you have just attained true gnosis.
Thank you.